Hello, I am going to present on rethinking gender development, insights from the complexity model of gender. As I've been thinking about these topics, I randomly discovered the beautiful art and science of Maria Marian in my son's book about women in science. I found out that through her art, she was the first to document the metamorphosis of butterflies. Until her work, they did not know that butterflies developed from caterpillars. They were studying dead butterflies and not living butterflies in their natural context. As I think about this, there are so many connections and metaphors in her story, art, and research that inform or relate to the need for psychology to develop an integrative science of gender that aims to include gender development of all people in all their diversities in context and in process. The goal of this project is along those lines. It's to draw on many domains of development and areas of psychology to build an integrative approach to gender development, to start laying the groundwork and building a framework in which gender development can be understood in all its inclusive and contextual complexity. Like mistakes were made in early attempts to understand butterflies and caterpillars, historical approaches to understanding gender development don't account for the complexity of gender. Something isn't working. For example, current approaches, they're the historical approaches, but they're still current, do not account for gender diversity. They're not inclusive of gender non-binary or trans identities. Dimensions of gender are often confused or blended, and perhaps because of that, identity is not well understood. In any case, we need to approach gender development in a way that addresses these limitations. Attempts at these solutions are complicated because gender is complicated. But don't worry, we're going to make it easy. For now, we're just going to really focus on the arrow on the right side of the screen. But before getting into that arrow and what it represents, let's do a quick overview and simplification of the complexity model of gender. Part A is an expansion of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. For now, we can just focus on the general idea from that model that development occurs within immediate and broad cultural context. Those contexts influence development across the lifespan within socio-historical context, which means that these contexts change over historical time. Part B is emphasizing that gender has different dimensions and that those dimensions are multidimensional in and of themselves. And gender identity and gender expression, they overlap and they influence one another. When I first started this project, I was fascinated by how helpful it was to focus on the independence of identity and expression. For example, masculine women and feminine men, just to give a quick, simple example. Now I'm fascinated by their interconnections, which is what I'm going to focus on today in that arrow, the interconnection between identity and expression. Really the purpose of this video in a nutshell. It's to understand that even though gender identity and expression can be independent, they inform one another in a developmental process in ways that depend on the immediate and broad context across the lifespan. So now let's get back to the interconnection. It turns out that zooming in on that arrow representing interconnection really ends up looking like this. And I know it's even more complicated, but really, this is just a visualization of three integrative frameworks. So let's take a look at these frameworks to build the foundation for this approach to understanding gender development. Before getting into the three frameworks, first note that Bronfenbrenner's ecological model is always present as an influence. Think of it as looming in the background throughout this video, but also probably just in everyday life as well. Second, note that these frameworks overlap, but an overview of each should help simplify things, even if doing them one at a time makes it a little bit artificial. Let's start with the gender self-socialization model. According to this model, children actively construct their gender identity by striving for cognitive consistency. They try to align their gender label, gender stereotypes, and how well their attributes match those beliefs. So a boy might say, I'm a boy, boys are strong, And in striving for consistency might ask, am I strong? Another example of cognitive consistency is the boy saying, I like scary movies and I'm a boy, so boys must like scary movies. A second framework is Jackson and Busey's gender self-categorization model. They emphasize that knowledge about gender and others' perceptions of our gender expression shapes our identity. This is a reciprocal process, meaning that our expression influences others' perceptions of us, which shapes our identity, which is also affected by our knowledge of gender. So, for example, as an individual, not as an academic or as a scholar, but just a person living in this world, do I think that gender is binary? Or as another example, do I think that gender is fluid or in contrast more stable? The third model is Levitt's LGBTQ plus gender approach, which emphasizes intersectionality, or the idea that gender, sexual orientation, and gender expression intersect. Also emphasize functions, or that social identity provides security and belonging. And last, developmental fit, or the idea of finding the right group, which is influenced by the available cultural categories. So, for example, non-binary groups and identities didn't always exist, and now that they do, people who fit those categories best can find groups of others with that same identity. Now let's map these three frameworks onto the model. So this slide is just to emphasize the color coding, so you can see that these three frameworks are in the everywhere, everything, everywhere, all at once model. Ideally, now, this image isn't so overwhelming. Here you can see that each of the three frameworks are represented. The other images that we haven't discussed and that weren't on the previous slide just represent the dimensions of gender identity and expression. So if you start at the top, you can see the two circles from Jackson and Busey's model, and then moving down to those tan circles, you can see the gender self-socialization model, and then all the way at the bottom in that green circle, social identity, representing the LGBTQ plus genders approach. And then in the middle, you see the gender identity and expression are represented. We're going to use Billy Porter as an example to understand gender development across frameworks. Billy Porter is a famous singer, actor, Oscar dress-wearing, cisgender, not transgender, gay man with a feminine gender expression. He is best known for wearing this dress pictured here to the Oscars. He's also from Pittsburgh, and this, if you note, the Pittsburgh bridges represented in the dress inspired by Billy Porter's Oscar dress that was part of an exhibit in Pittsburgh honoring Porter. Billy Porter wrote about his life in a memoir entitled Unprotected. So Billy grew up in the 1970s in Pittsburgh. And as you might imagine, Billy did not know much about being gay or diversity and gender expression. His knowledge was that boys are boys, period, end of story. Along with this knowledge, he also held stereotypic beliefs like boys are strong. Now, one day in first grade gym class, all the boys were asked to do pull-ups. Billy was the only boy in first grade who couldn't. Reflected in gender harassment, Billy was perceived as different for this behavioral gender expression, not being able to perform the pull-up. Here we can put two frameworks together and see that Billy understood himself to be a boy. That was the only option, period. He internalized the idea that boys are strong, and when he couldn't do a pull-up, he knows he is perceived as different because the kids made fun of him. The result is inconsistency, that cognitive inconsistency. I'm a boy, but I'm not strong. And since those two beliefs, that I'm a boy and boys are strong, are concrete and unchangeable in his mind, he concludes there must be something wrong with him. So what's the result? The result is that Billy doesn't feel typical or content. That inconsistency is uncomfortable. And bringing in that third framework, he doesn't benefit from the functions of social identity. He doesn't benefit from security or having a sense of belonging with others. Billy's story doesn't end on this sad note, though. Things change, historically and developmentally. Billy found affirmation in the choir. He is such a talented singer. And that provided an expanded understanding and increased cognitive consistency. Over Billy's development and throughout history and times in the US culture, there were national shifts in LGBTQ visibility and acceptance that influenced how Billy was perceived and how he understood himself. Those shifts, along with expressing his gender as a talented gay man, he found community and social identity in queer and performing arts spaces, which provided security and belonging, reinforcing and influencing his gender expression. So again, even though identity and expression can be independent, they can inform one another in a developmental process in ways that depend on immediate and broad context and across the lifespan. In short, it's complicated, it's everything, everywhere, all at once, and over time. Breaking the whole into its parts, zooming in real close and looking at those individual parts can help us solve the puzzle. But it is also equally important to zoom back out and understand that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So even this is complicated.